Hi everyone, welcome to Poisonous People. Today I want to talk a little bit about the narcissism spectrum because I feel like this is a crucial aspect of understanding narcissism, and I don't think enough attention is paid to this topic. And what I have seen discussed about this topic kind of leaves a little bit to be desired. So understanding the narcissism spectrum is really important because it's going to give you a much clearer picture as far as what narcissism looks like in somebody with NPD versus the average human being. So let's focus on what people generally mean when they are talking about the narcissism spectrum. Typically, you see people acknowledging that everyone has narcissism, and at the lower end of the spectrum, you have people who are less narcissistic, and then at the higher end of the spectrum, you have people who are more narcissistic. And that's pretty much all that people have said about this topic. There's very little discussion as far as what makes somebody less narcissistic or what makes somebody more narcissistic. So that's one of the problems with conceptualizing the narcissism spectrum in this manner. But the other problem is that this is not a spectrum at all. This is actually a scale. So when people use this model to explain the narcissism spectrum, what they're actually doing is they're rating narcissism as a whole, and narcissism isn't really something that can be judged as a whole because it's made up of many parts, 9 parts as a matter of fact. And so that's why this representation of narcissism is misleading. And it's one of the reasons people are confused about narcissism and NPD. Overall, it does not allow for the rich, diverse variety that exists from person to person. And notice I did say person, I didn't say narcissist. So if you're watching this video, you have narcissism, whether you like it or not. And I hope that by explaining this concept in a different way, you will be able to see how your own narcissism differs from that of someone like myself or somebody who's a very malignant narcissist. Here is the analogy I would like you to consider. In the United States, every single individual has a 9-digit social security number. And when we use a social security number, we are using 10 possible numbers, 0 through 9, and those numbers can be repeated. This is a quick little screenshot of a permutations calculator that I found online, and the total possible permutations would equal 1 billion. So theoretically, we have a possible 1 billion separate, distinct, and unique social security numbers that we could assign to individuals in the United States. Now, the reason I chose the social security number as my illustration is because there are 9 slots to fill. There are 9 digits. When it comes to narcissism, and specifically narcissistic personality disorder, there are 9 traits to choose from. And when we are diagnosing NPD, a person has to have a minimum of 5 of those 9 traits. But as I said, every human being has narcissism. And so every single human being has the capacity to have their own unique combination of narcissistic traits. And I'm going to refer to this as your unique narcissism number. So if we look at a 9-digit narcissism number, we would have each one of those digits representing a scale that would rate each of the 9 traits of narcissism. So these letters that you see stand for grandiosity, fantasy, special, admiration, entitlement, exploitation, empathy, envy, and arrogance. Now, it's my personal belief that nobody ever scores a 0 on any narcissistic trait. all of us, because we're human, because we're flawed, because we deceive ourselves by our own goodness and our own capabilities, I automatically start every single human being at the number 1. I don't think it's possible for somebody to never be envious or never be arrogant or never have low empathy. So everyone on my interpretation of the narcissism spectrum starts with number 1, and 1 is the lowest possible number you can have. So that means we are only using digits 1 through 9. So if you look at the permutations calculator again, we get a total of 387,420,489 distinct and different permutations. Now, I just want to be clear, this narcissism number is just something that I conceptualized. This is not like an official way of rating narcissism. This is just a way that I like to envision it to help me understand the narcissism spectrum on a deeper and more accurate level. So, what might that actually look like? Well, I imagine it might look something like this. So on the far left, what I've done is I've inverted that scale, and instead of simply rating somebody's narcissism overall, I've displayed each of the 9 criteria for narcissism, and I've rated each and every one of those separately on a scale of 1 to 10. So the way that I rated this is if you're below a 5, that does not count as a narcissistic trait. If you're at a 5, you're kind of on the border. You could go either way, but anything above a 5 is definitely a narcissistic trait. And so on this graph, I plotted 5 hypothetical cases so you can see how different their narcissism fluctuates, whether they are more narcissistic or less narcissistic. So let's break this down because it's kind of hard to see what's going on with all these lines all over the place. And let's look at these one at a time. So the first one we're going to look at is a hypothetical narcissism profile for myself. Now, in a previous video that I did on diagnosing narcissistic personality disorder, especially when it comes to arrogance, I revealed that I do not have NPD, but I actually do have one narcissistic trait, and that is arrogance. So just trying to rate myself on this hypothetical scale that I created, here are the numbers that I gave myself. I pretty much put myself all the way in the non-narcissistic green range, except when it came to my arrogance, and I put myself at an 8. The irony is I'm not very grandiose, but it's possible I was a little grandiose here. I'm probably not that bad. It's possible that my arrogance is not that high. It might be more of a 7 or a 6. But as I said, in my model, anything above a 5 qualifies as a narcissistic trait. So looking at this portrait of me, I am somebody that is not a narcissist. I do not have NPD. I just have one pretty serious character flaw. And so that's how I might look on the narcissism spectrum. Now, already you can see how different this is from that very one-dimensional scale of just 1 to 10. You're at the lower end of the scale versus you're at the higher end of the scale. If you look at this, you can't say that about me. You can't say, well, she's at the lower end of the scale, because I'm at the lower end for 8 of the 9 traits. And then the 9th trait there, it's really high on the scale. And that's why I don't think the common way that we look at the narcissism spectrum is effective. I don't think it goes far enough in helping us to understand what narcissism looks like. Let's compare me against somebody else who has no narcissistic traits. So here we have, I'm in the blue, and the non-NPD person is represented by the green line. And here you can see where this non-narcissist who has 0 narcissistic traits actually scores higher than I do in certain areas. I would say that envy is this hypothetical person's weak spot, and it is more of a problem for them than it is for me. And then, of course, you see my arrogance going off the charts there. So how could we honestly say that this person scores a 1 on the narcissism spectrum and I'm like a 2, and somebody else maybe with 2 traits is a 3? This is all very arbitrary, and it doesn't really tell us much about that individual person's weak spots and their strengths. Because we can even look at this and say, both of us, both myself and the average random non-narcissist, we have a strength in that we don't really have difficulty with grandiosity, or we don't really struggle with the need to feel special. So when you look at the full narcissism picture, you're not just taking into account a person's deficits, but also their strengths. So now let's look at some examples of people who actually do qualify for a diagnosis of NPD. And these people are also different as night and day. So this first example, I am calling hypothetical toxic. As you can see, this person scored higher than a 5 on 5 different traits. That alone qualifies them for an NPD diagnosis. But the reason why I feel that this person is toxic and not necessarily abusive or malignant is because I personally believe that somebody has to score very high on traits like exploitation of others, or lack of empathy, or a sense of entitlement. When they score high in those 3 traits, I believe that the narcissism is much more severe. I modeled this person after an old friend of mine. So this is a female narcissist. She was immature. She was a little bit demanding. You know, you kind of had to go with her way of doing things. It got annoying, but really nothing terrible, like nothing you couldn't deal with. One of the reasons I've chosen this person as my model is because I never once saw her exploit people, ever. So if you look at this, I gave her a 1 on exploiting other people. And if you see my video on exploitation, exploitation is a synonym for abuse. And I made the case in that video that it's possible for somebody to be a narcissist, for somebody to have NPD, and not be abusive. This is a perfect example of that. I also felt that her empathy could go either way. Like sometimes she did show empathy for you, other times she didn't. She had really great relationships with certain friends. There was also a very strong relationship with her mother and her sister. So she had the ability to get along with people. And that's why I call this NPD Toxic. She definitely was the kind of person that you could sustain a relationship with. And so this is how her narcissism may look compared to somebody with a different narcissism profile or narcissism number. So let's take a look at a hypothetical example of somebody with NPD who is beyond toxic. And I call this hypothetical abusive. I deliberately gave this person all 9 traits of narcissism. So right away, that's going to make them more difficult to deal with than somebody with only 5 traits. This person was actually modeled after my narcissistic ex. His need to be admired, his sense of entitlement, and his level of arrogance was so high that is what resulted in the abuse. It was as if those 3 traits never got a rest. They were just on all the time, and you never got a break from those 3 traits. So every little thing was interpreted through the lens of those 3 traits. And that caused this individual to feel very threatened. And that caused this individual to start arguments with me over nothing. Now let's look at a hypothetical malignant. So I gave this person a 10 for grandiosity, entitlement, exploitation, lack of empathy, and a 10 for arrogance. But what you can see is he has a 5 for envy. So if we look back to the hypothetical abusive, this person, the abusive person, had 9 traits of narcissism. But with the hypothetical malignant, I wanted to stress that this person has only 8 traits of narcissism over a 5. So this hypothetical malignant person actually has fewer narcissistic traits than the hypothetical abusive narcissist. But what makes this person malignant is the types of traits that they have, as well as the score. So again, I'm plotting this in the way that I am to show you the possibilities of how people with NPD can differ. And it's not about saying, oh, this one's got all 9. I mean, it's possible to have all 9 and really not be that bad. It's possible to have the bare minimum of 5 or even less than 5 and actually be a pretty awful person to have to contend with. Just because somebody has a clinical diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder, it doesn't automatically sentence them to a lifetime of being branded this awful, horrible person. Overall, you might have somebody in the higher end of the spectrum or the lower end of the spectrum, but it's really not a very complete way of looking at individual narcissism. I hope that this has helped you understand the narcissism spectrum on a bit of a deeper level. I'm Jen Guerriero, and this is Poisonous People. Thanks for watching.